In this video, I'm going to introduce the idea of phylogenetic trees. When we talk about phylogenetic trees, we're basically talking about a method to cluster organisms together into similar groups. As you know, it involves the process of categorizing and classifying living things based on various similarities and differences, and those differences can be ecological, behavioral, morphological, or genetic. Classifying animals into groups based on similarities is an important part of understanding evolution. The taxonomic system that is most familiar to us is that developed by the Swedish biologist and physician Carl Linnaeus. Linnaeus literally wrote the book on taxonomy called Systema Naturae, and the taxonomic classification system that Linnaeus developed arranged organisms in a hierarchical fashion, with subspecies grouped into species, species grouped into genera, genera grouped into orders, and similarly up to kingdoms. When we think about the Linnaeus classification system, we typically think about clustering organisms based on morphological differences. So say we were collecting a bunch of invertebrates from a river and we wanted to determine what this particular species is, this specimen that we collected. We might use a dichotomous key shown here to help us decide based on morphological characters what the species is. So we would start at the top and answer the question, does it have a shell? And it doesn't have a shell. So we go on to the second question, does it have legs? Yes, it has legs. And the next question, how many legs does it have? Well, this specimen has 3 pairs of legs. We'd go on through the dichotomous key, does it have wings? Nope. And how many tails does it have? Well, it has 3 tails. And finally down to the nitty-gritty of whether or not it has gills on its abdomen, and we can finally conclude that it's a damselfly nymph. But this system, as great as it is, can present certain challenges. So different stages or different sexes may look different, and the characteristics that are chosen may or may not be the most suitable. For example, color is a characteristic that is often not a suitable trait to do this type of morphological classification system. So while Linnaeus came up with a very good system for classifying organisms, he didn't provide insight into why they could be classified this way. It was really Charles Darwin, with his crazy new idea of evolution by natural selection, that provided the answer to why animals could be classified correctly under the Linnaean taxonomic system. So Darwin provided the insight that animals developed through a branching pattern that represented descent with modification. The changes that took place over time in response to the environment in which they lived was the way in which species evolved. After Darwin, it was the German biologist Will Hennig who looked at taxonomy through the lens of Darwin's ideas about evolution. And in 1966, he published the book Phylogenetic Systematics, which classifies organisms according to their evolutionary history. The phylogenetic tree is a way of representing the evolutionary relationships among organisms. Here we see a phylogenetic tree showing that species A, B, C, and D have a common ancestral species at the base of this tree. So phylogenetics allows us to classify organisms at different scales, from tracing variations in the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, to clustering groups of vertebrates, to as large a scale as grouping all living organisms into a broad, complete, larger tree of life. Phylogenies are often represented in different formats, but are read the same way. So here on the left is a tree format, and on the right is a ladder format for a tree, for a phylogeny. And the interpretation of each of the trees shown here is identical. Each tree branch ends in a species, or in this case a group of related species, or a taxon. The points where branches split are called nodes, and they indicate a common ancestor of the groups that follow to the right of that node. Here the red dot represents the most recent common ancestor of crocodilians and birds, whereas the blue dot represents the most recent common ancestor of all amphibians, mammals, snakes, turtles, crocodilians, and birds. And of course, time is represented from the root toward the tips of the branches, which in this case is read from left to right. For those taxa that are closer to the root, those have a deeper ancestral lineage, meaning they evolved further back in time, whereas taxa that are further away from the root are more recently evolved species. So when you really think about it, it is pretty incredible that Darwin imagined a fairly accurate idea of the tree of life long before anyone knew anything about genetics or heredity or how traits are inherited.